Rares are often more complex or experimental cards than cards in other rarities, which can lead to both really strong cards and really weak cards. So today we're going to go over some of the lower end of the spectrum and talk about the worst rares in Magic. Starting us off at number 10, we have Vizzerdrix. This is a 6/6 beast with a mana cost of 6 and 1 blue, with no abilities. Now, longtime Magic players will be able to tell at one glance how bad this is, but some newcomers may not get it. You see, the more mana you have to pay for an effect, the more you need to get out of it. Getting a simple creature with no abilities for this mana cost is simply not worth it. To see how bad this is, you need to compare it to cards you could be spending your mana on instead. At the same mana cost, you could be casting Platinum Angel, a card with the impressive ability to make it so that you literally cannot lose the game. Hullbreaker Horror, an even bigger creature that can be cast at instant speed, can't be countered, and anytime you cast a spell, you can bounce any non-land permanent or return a spell to its owner's hand before it resolves. Or you could cast Karn Liberated, a planeswalker that can exile cards from your opponent's hand on a +4, or tick down to remove any permanent. Compared to literally any of these cards, Vizzerdrix doesn't accomplish anything. Honestly, I'm not sure why they thought this card should be rare. Even early on in the game, where creatures were significantly worse, this card was always terrible on rate, and it's not like it's flashy or interesting. If you told someone this was a common, they'd believe you in a heartbeat. Vizzerdrix is ultimately a really confusing card that doesn't really have a home. And at number 9, we have Keldon Battlewagon. This is a 0/3 Juggernaut artifact creature with a mana cost of 5 with trample, which means it can deal excess combat damage to your opponent while attacking. The abilities where it can't block, when it attacks, you sacrifice at the end of the combat, and you can tap an untapped creature you control to increase its power by that creature's power until the end of the turn. A 0/3 that can't even block for 5 mana is one of the most atrocious rates I've ever seen on a card. Now, the idea of tapping all of your creatures to get one giant trampling threat is pretty fun, but unfortunately it's not particularly strong. Trample isn't the best evasion out there, and if you have a ton of creatures on board, you could probably just attack with them anyway. The combination of sacrificing itself when it attacks and not being able to block really kills any possible niche the card could have. Your opponent can just take the damage knowing the Battlewagon will die whenever it attacks. It also doesn't actually put any extra damage on the board. The only situation where this card could be useful is in Vigilance creatures, which don't have to tap themselves to attack. So you can attack with the Battlewagon and the Vigilance creatures, and then tap all your creatures to pump your Battlewagon to put out a lot of extra damage. But if you're trying to put out extra damage, there are way better cards you can use for that. Battlewagon could have its stats buffed, given the ability to block, not have to sacrifice itself, and it would only be a decent card. The number of downsides stacked onto a fairly mediocre effect means that Battlewagon is easily one of the worst rares in the game, but it's still more useful than the rest of the cards on this list. And at number 8, we have Helm of Chatzuk. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 1 with the ability to pay 1 and tap it to give a creature banding until the end of the turn. Banding is an old defunct keyword where you have your creatures attack or block as a band, as long as all but one of them have banding. Creatures in a band or blocked together allow you to choose the order the damage is assigned to your creatures, not your opponent. So, for example, if you have a 1/1 and a 3/3 attacking as a band and they get blocked by a 2/2, you can assign all the damage to your 3/3 rather than your 1/1, so it will survive the combat. Now, this is a pretty niche use case, and things only get worse from there. You see, because the creatures attack as a band, you only need one blocker to stop all of their damage. Usually, keywords on creatures make them harder to block, such as Flying, which makes it so only very specific creatures can block them, or Menace, which makes it so your opponent can only block them with at least 2 creatures. Making your creatures harder to block is good because it means that you're more likely to deal damage to your opponent. Banding, on the other hand, actually makes your board easier to block by making it require less creatures. Sure, it can possibly save your creatures, but it's usually easier to just not attack with creatures that would die, or you could actually give those creatures a form of evasion. All in all, there's really no reason to spend your mana on Helm of Chatzuk. And at number 7, we have North Star. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 4, and it has the ability where you can pay 4 mana and tap it to make it so that you can spend mana as if there were mana of any color for the rest of the turn. Not only is paying 4 mana for an artifact to get color fixing not good, having to pay 4 mana every turn to even use the artifact is even worse. There are other cards that help you fix your mana, such as Chromatic Lantern, a 3 mana artifact that you can tap for any color of mana and lets your lands tap for any color of mana. Not only is this artifact both cheaper to play and use than North Star, it actually ramps you, which is far more impactful than simply fixing your mana. Even then, Lantern has very rarely seen competitive play to enable some niche 5-color decks. It's not even good at fixing your mana in comparison to cards like Prismite, another bad card that lets you pay 2 mana to add 1 mana of any color. If you're trying to cast a spell like Archmage's Charm, a card that's very color intensive with Prismite, it will cost you 6 mana, whereas Painted off of North Star will cost 7 mana. Not only is North Star's effect not worthwhile, it's far worse than the other options available. And at number 6, we have Blessed Wind. This is a sorcery with the mana cost is 7 and 2 white, with the effect where target player's life total becomes 20. Life gain cards have a reputation for being really bad, but this one is one of the worst life gain cards in the game. Resetting your life total to 20 isn't even that good in terms of gaining life, and certainly isn't worth 9 mana. There's another card called Providence, a sorcery with a mana cost of 5 and 2 white that sets your life total to 26 if you have it in your opening hand, and can set your life total to 26 again if you cast it normally. This spell gains you more life, costs less mana, lets you start the game with extra life if you have it in your opening hand, and is an awful card that sees no competitive play. If we leave the realms of cards that only gain you life, Timely Reinforcements is a sorcery that costs 2 and 1 white, that gains you 6 life if you have less life than your opponent, and gives you 3 1/1 soldiers if your opponent has more creatures than you. This card actually has seen some competitive play as a sideboard card for control decks against aggro decks, as it usually lets you get a bunch of creatures and gain some life back. This won't gain you as much life as Blessed Wind, but it costs 1/3 of the mana and gives you blockers that can possibly kill a few of your opponent's threats. Blessed Wind is pretty bad at gaining your life, but it does have one other use: lowering your opponent's life total. If your opponent has more than 20 life, you can use it to bring their life total down to 20. However, this is a pretty niche situation. There are actually ways to gain so much life that your opponent can't reasonably kill you, such as looping Kitchen Finks with Heliod's Sun Crown. However, these are extremely rare, and even in these circumstances, there are better cards for the situation. Cards like Magister Sphinx or Torgar can set your opponent's life total to 10, which is far better, as it makes it easier to kill them once they enter the battlefield. Blessed Wind fails both at gaining you life and at countering life gain strategies, giving it no use cases whatsoever. And at number 5, we have Mungha Wurm. This is a 6/5 worm with a mana cost of 2 and 2 green, and the ability where you can only untap 1 land during each of your untap steps. So, there's this card called Winter Orb, which makes it so that neither player can untap more than 1 land as long as it's untapped. Winter Orb is a pretty famously hard card to play under, making it so that only you have to play under its effect while your opponent gets all of their mana every turn is pretty terrible. Now, Worm is a big creature that can kill your opponent in a hurry. The problem is that the downside is simply too high. The worst thing that can happen is your opponent finding a way to make it unable to attack without actually killing it, in which case you'll have to deal with its downside without getting the upside of a nice big creature. Even if your opponent can't do that, they can still take advantage of Worm's downside by simply removing it during your turn after your untap step, so you won't get to untap all of your lands, but you don't even get to attack with your nice big creature. The thing is, even if you do manage to keep your Worm out, the mana advantage your opponent will get makes it really hard to come back. You'll pretty much be relying entirely on your Worm while your opponent gets to play as normal. Really, the best thing you can do with Mungha Wurm is donate it to your opponent to make them deal with the downside. But at that point, you should really just play Winter Orb. And at number 4, we have Wood Elemental. This is an elemental with a mana cost of 3 and 1 green, with the abilities where as it enters the battlefield, you can sacrifice any number of untapped forest, and its power and toughness are each equal to the number of force you sacrifice this way. Now, sacrificing your lands is one of the scariest costs you can put on a card, because getting rid of your mana means you can't do anything. Wood Elemental makes that cost even worse by requiring you to sacrifice untapped lands, meaning you can't even use them for mana on the turn you play the Elemental. There's another card called Uvenwald Hydra, which is a creature with a mana cost of 4 and 2 green, and has a power and toughness equal to the number of lands you control, has reach so it can block flying creatures, and also finds a land from your deck and puts it into the battlefield when you play it. So on turn 6, you could play Hydra to go find another land and have a 7/7 on the field, or you could play Wood Elemental, sacrifice 2 lands, and have a pitiful 2/2 on the field. Now, creatures have gotten better over the years, but even for the time, Wood Elemental was laughably bad. The only real situation where I think this could be good is with Titania, a creature which makes a 5/3 elemental creature token whenever a land goes from your battlefield to your graveyard. But even then, there are cards that let you sacrifice your lands that are way better, like Zurin Orb or Sylvan Safekeeper, both of which are way cheaper and allow you to sacrifice lands for actual beneficial effects, and allow you to sacrifice tapped lands, so it doesn't even work in that niche. And at number 3, we have Alabaster Leech. This is a 1/3 leech with a mana cost of 1 white that has the massive downside of making all your white spells cost 1 white more mana to cast. Now, there is a whole cycle of these cards, so Alabaster Leech is on here to represent the whole cycle, though it's also the worst of the bunch. The downside of making your spells cost more is massive. Cards like Thalia are considered amazing specifically for their ability to make your opponent's cards cost 1 more mana, and cards with similar effects have almost always seen play. Even worse, Leech's stats aren't even good for its costs. Recently, a card called Staunch Shieldmate was released, which is a creature with the same stats and cost as Alabaster Leech with no downside at all, which makes sense because a 1/3 with no abilities is only an okay stat line. Having 1 power is so little that your opponent can just ignore it for the entirety of the game because it can't deal enough damage, though the toughness is nice for letting it block a lot of creatures profitably. Leech would really need to at least be a 3/3 for this downside to be appropriate, but even then, the downside would mean it was only an okay card. Even worse, due to only making your white spells cost more, you can't use something like Donate to use its downside against your opponent, because if they're of a different color, it won't increase the cost of their cards. And at number 2, we have Wormfang Manta. This is a 6/1 Nightmare Fish Beast with a mana cost of 5 and 2 blue, with flying and the abilities where, when it enters the battlefield, you skip your next turn, and when it leaves the battlefield, you take an extra turn. Here we have another badly statted creature with a frankly bizarre set of abilities. A 6/1 is an awful stat line, and while flying helps, you need a lot more if you're going to pay 7 mana for it. The thing that landed on this list is skipping your next turn when you play it. Now, you can get that turn back by getting it to leave the field before you end your next turn, but there are a few issues with that. The thing is, you'll still skip your next turn, and if your next turn is the extra turn you go off on Wormfang, you'll just skip that one. That means if you play out Wormfang Manta and sacrifice it as soon as it comes down, you'll simply skip your extra turn and the turn order will continue as normal, meaning you got nothing for your 7 mana. Giving your opponent an extra turn is such a big downside that there's almost nothing you would trade for it, and a badly statted creature certainly isn't worth it. It's also worth bringing up Eater of Days, a similar card that forces you to skip your next 2 turns when you play it, but is a 4 mana 9/8 with flying and trample. The reason why Wormfang made onto this list over Eater of Days is that there are a few ways to make both of these cards better, but they work much better with Eater of Days. With cards like Hushbringer, you can make it so their next enter the battlefield abilities don't trigger at all. If you do that, Eater of Days will give you a truly imposing creature, whereas Wormfang will do less damage, be easier to remove, and cost more mana. It does give you an extra turn when it dies, however, so they both kind of have their advantages. The other place where these cards could be used are alongside the Beamtown Bullies, a legendary creature that allows you to put creatures from your graveyard into the field under your opponent's control, but makes them sacrifice it at the end of the turn. However, the creature will die at the end of their turn, so Wormfang's extra turn and skip turn will cancel out, while Eater of Days will eat up 2 of their turns. Now, neither of these applications are good enough to put up results in any format, but they are technically ways you can use these cards, and Eater of Days is a better card for these strategies, though really both cards are so bad and hard to use that they aren't worth it. And at number 1, we have One with Nothing. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 black that simply allows you to discard your hand to... that's pretty much it. That's right, this card has no positive effect whatsoever. This is obviously pretty terrible, and that's kind of the point of the card's design. The card is less of a piece of the metagame and more of a challenge from Wizards of the Coast to players to try and find some way to make this card good. And players have been trying for years to find a deck where One with Nothing works, though they haven't found anything yet. People thought it might have a resurgence back when Madness came back, Madness being a mechanic that allows you to cast cards when you discard them, but it didn't end up working out. Rather famously, there was one format where One with Nothing was at least a little useful. Back in the standard format of its day, there was a deck running around that used Ebony Owl Netsuk, which was a cheap artifact that dealt 4 damage to your opponent each turn if they had a full hand, and used cards that made both players draw cards to keep their opponent's hand full. In this one specific matchup, One with Nothing was actually a useful sideboard card, as it allowed you to empty your hand, and you'd be able to quickly fill your hand again if you really needed to. Though this was only ever relevant in one particular standard format, and if there were better options that actually gave you some form of benefit for discarding cards, players would have used that instead. Still, the fact that One with Nothing, which is certainly one of the worst rares in the game, saw any play at all is still noteworthy. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other more awful rares you think we may have missed? Or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, we'd love to hear about those things down in the comments.